Good evening, my friends. I am Mike X Welch, local author, and tonight I am going to be reading a short story from my collection, ENANTIODROMIA, which is available at Amazon for the low price of $4.99 paperback and 99 cents ebook. Tonight, the story I'm going to read is Tuesdays with Morandarth, which is in the vein of H.P. Lovecraft and hopefully a little Stephen Kingish too. First, I want to shout out two authors. They are both part of Writing Block, the collective that I'm part of and originally published through their anthologies. One is Michael Hayes, that's Haase, and he is actually the founder and one of the six principles of Writing Block. He is doing some serialized storytelling on Ko-fi.com. That's Kofi.com. He is a wonderful friend and an even better human being and father, and he is one of our medical professionals, and he is simply the best, and I would love to have you guys search him out and read his stuff and contribute to him on Ko-fi if you can. The other person I want to mention is G.A. Finocchiaro. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. He has published today a short anthology called Grace Falls through Writing Block. It is a collection of wonder and fright, an anthology of wonder and fright it's called. Nothing is as it seems in Grace Falls, Pennsylvania. The town looks and feels like every other small, isolated town across America. But something's clearly sinister happening in this town, and this anthology is some short stories, but they're all written in this town. They all feature this town and their situations happening in this town. So it's something that I would love for any of my followers or fans to pick up. Spell the last name as Finocchiaro, G as in George, A, Finocchiaro, and the book is Grace Falls. Please check it out. All right. I hope everybody's staying safe during this wonderful social distancing marathon, and I know that we're doing fine here in the Welch household. Chief behind me here is just chilling, aren't you, buddy? I promise he's not stuffed. He's really there. So here we go. This is Tuesdays at Morandarth. Yes, Tuesdays with Morandarth. It is, of course, a play on the title of the book, Tuesdays with Maury. And I hope that you guys enjoy this. Sandy Kavanaugh is a deeply unhappy man. Sandy is also a best-selling author and a millionaire several times over. He is married to a woman he has loved since college. This woman bore him two wonderful children and made a home for them all in pastoral southern Maine. Sandy Kavanaugh owns multiple houses in New England and a small vacation pad south of Los Angeles. He rarely visits any of them. Despite Sandy's phenomenal success, he is considered a writer of merely average skill within literary circles. Over 24 of his stories and novels have been developed into television or film projects, with the vast majority being panned as B-movie quality at best. People recognize his face on the street and often ask for photographs or autographs, both of which he always obliges. None of these things cause Sandy to be a deeply unhappy man. What makes Sandy truly miserable is the demon under his barn. After more than 40 years in thrall to Morandarth, Sandy plans to confront the demon today. This could lead to a horribly painful and prolonged death. As such, Sandy's resolve brings misery spiked with anxiety. But at 63 years of age, Sandy feels as though it is time to stand up for himself. Sandy trudges through the New England snow to the ramshackle barn on the eastern edge of his rural property. The snow is dry and powdery, and so it flees his steps and whips around on the wind onto his exposed neck. He raises the hood of his heavy coat, With his gloves on, it takes several tries. He is growing frustrated. The shifting winds find a way to deliver snow into every crevice of his outfit. There is no sun in the sky, it seems. There are only clouds to look down on Sandy as his boot sticks in the snow, causing him to put his bootless right foot in the frigid powder. He curses, reverses an unsteady step, and places his numbing foot back into the boot. Melancholy blooms anew within his chest, and the world's indifference to it abides. Upon reaching the barn, Sandy carefully unlocks the several chains that hold the door shut. Their purpose is not to keep Morandarth in, as nothing can keep the demon in or out of anything or anywhere, but to dissuade any interlopers from stumbling into the barn and losing their own soul. Sandy can hardly live with what he did over 4 decades ago. The idea of someone else doing it due to his carelessness would be unendurable. Twice yearly he makes this trek, commanded directly by Morandarth. Always on the Tuesday and the first week of February, the anniversary of Sandy's fateful encounter with the demon, to remove remains, and then 6 months later, on the first Tuesday of August, to bring the sacrifice. That the weather is miserable at both times in New England is coincidental, but is almost certainly made worse by Sandy's dread at having to face the monster in person. Indeed, it could be warm and perfectly cloudless with no humidity, and Sandy's soul would still be desolate. One August, early in his service to Morandarth, Sandy ignored the psychic directive from the beast for a full day. The next morning he woke to a yard full of dead birds, not just a few, but so many, of varied species, that Sandy could not see grass for a full acre. The blue feathers of robins overlapping the black feathers of crows, which overlapped with the gray feathers of pigeons. The white breast of some poor fowl shined under the carnage, near the tire swing suspended from the massive oak in the backyard. And all of their black, glossy eyes stared at him in single-minded avian judgment. His children howled at the windows in terror, tears dropping onto their pajamas. He tasked his wife with securing the kids and began the cleanup process, lugging dozens of green-black garbage bags into the barn. And after that, Sandy secures the locks on the inside of the barn door. He pulls off the puffy glove on his right hand and stabs at the smartphone in his left, activating the flashlight. He hands it around the still gloom of the barn. There is nothing in the structure. No rats, not so much as a spider, making a home in a high corner of the beams. Nothing living is willing to share space with Morandarth. Nothing except Sandy Kavanaugh, and even he can't bear it any longer. After grabbing an unused burlap bag from a nearby folded pile on the floor, Sandy proceeds down a set of crumbling concrete steps into a chamber beneath the barn. There is a faint, musty smell in the air that thickens to something far more organic and foul as he descends. Sandy's barn sits over a massive stone cistern that now serves as a basement for the place. He installed the concrete stairs himself decades ago, tired of using a rickety ladder for access. At the bottom of the steps, in a small 6-by-6-foot chamber, Sandy puts his back into moving aside the massive circular stone at the mouth of the cistern to gain access to Morandarth's cache. For most people, this would conjure an image of the apostles rolling away the stone in front of Jesus' tomb to find it happily empty. Not for Sandy. The bile comes up in his throat. He thinks that he would weep with joy to find this dark niche empty. He steps through the small threshold into the cavernous, dry cistern, pocketing his still illuminated phone. Sandy Kavanaugh would surely be dead and decomposing without Morandarth. The demon's voice fills the chamber, and Sandy, with dark reverberation. As has been the case for the last few years, Sandy was not careful to guard his thoughts when near the demon. He clears his mind of all but disgust and fear. These are like food to the creature, but he doesn't mind giving them away. Surely, Moran'd'arth. Sandy goes down on one knee, the patella finding a painful pebble to rest on with classic accuracy. Sandy waits for the demon to begin his usual admonition, reminding Sandy that it was he who sought out the demon and begged Morandarth to provide him with wealth and fame, not the other way around. Sandy needs no reminders, as the demon well knows. Every dollar Sandy spends on something, from a packet of gum to a sports car, weighs heavily on his tattered soul. Instead, Morandarth, still shrouded in pitch darkness, merely begins the agonizingly slow process of regurgitating the skeleton of the sacrifice Sandy brought him last summer. Fortunately, this year it is simply the remains of a fattened pig that Sandy had raised himself from a piglet. It could be far worse. In the years before Sandy locked the barn doors, Morandarth lured the occasional human to his lair. Once or twice, Sandy had been forced to provide the demon with a runaway or a hitchhiker or some other lost soul. Indeed, back in 1993, a desperate Sandy Kavanaugh threw an overzealous fan into its maw. The fan of Sandy's books had managed to stalk the writer all the way to his home, and when the young man wouldn't leave peacefully on that early August day, Sandy killed 2 birds with a Louisville slugger-shaped stone. The wet smacks and deep, bass, heavy rumbles end after what feels like a half hour. The smell of a stale pond full of dead amphibians wells off the creature. It has soaked into the stone walls and earthen floor of the cavern. Sandy still has the indignity of loading the pig's remains into the burlap sack to come. He rises. A torch bursts into flames a few inches to the right of Sandy's head. Despite this being the monster's ritual, only lighting the chamber once it has given the bones back, this never fails to make Sandy jump to the opposite wall in surprise. A sound like gravel being crushed emanates from the demon. Sandy has always understood this as the creature's version of laughter. He lifts his left foot from where it has landed and sees the crushed porcine skull underneath. Sandy moves back to the right, to the center of the chamber. Morandarth commands Sandy Kavanaugh's attention. Sandy Kavanaugh's attention is Morandarth's. Once, Sandy had made the mistake of using a different form of address to the demon, something like master or some other sniveling form of verbal supplication. Morandarth had whipped out a tentacle and bloodied the flesh of Sandy's bare bicep. For Morandarth, and for the rest of Morandarth's kind, Sandy reckoned, using a being's proper name was not only fitting but reverent. That Morandarth referred to Sandy by his full name at least confirmed it was appropriate. Morandarth was reverent to no one but Morandarth. Sandy Kavanaugh has served Morandarth adequately for many of Sandy Kavanaugh's years. Morandarth has provided Sandy Kavanaugh with what Sandy Kavanaugh asked. Morandarth commands that Sandy Kavanaugh continue to provide Morandarth with sacrifices and the sacrifices' removal until Sandy Kavanaugh no longer lives but is rotting in the earth or within Morandarth. This gives Sandy great pause. He had always hoped that the creature would avoid killing him, but now he is no longer sure. It also flies directly in the face of what Sandy wanted to ask the devil, release from their pact. Reading these thoughts, Morandarth thunders, Sandy Kavanaugh will do as Morandarth commands, not as Sandy Kavanaugh wishes. Morandarth has given Sandy Kavanaugh precisely what Sandy Kavanaugh bargained for. Sandy Kavanaugh's fame is such that almost every human in this world knows the name of Sandy Kavanaugh. Sandy Kavanaugh has more wealth than Sandy Kavanaugh can use in several pathetic lifetimes. Sandy swiftly prostrates himself before the indignant demon, whose singular eye has darkened in anger. Sandy looks up from his prone position on the dirt floor, his hands covering his ears, and takes in the full horror of Morandarth. Morandarth is a greenish blue-black round mass of goo at least 12 feet high and 8 feet in circumference. Its main feature is a solitary, massive, and lidless yellow eye set approximately in the top middle of the terrifying morass of tentacles and viscous fluid. There is a small mouth south of the eye, but this is only opened when feeding or vomiting. The creature does not speak from this orifice. Sandy has never counted the tentacles. He knows only that they are legion and that they are sharp. Sandy posits that Morandarth is like an iceberg, in that there is much, much more of the beast below the ground. He glimpsed underneath Morandarth once, in fact, when Sandy brought down the manic, struggling stalker fan in '93. Upon being dragged into Morandarth's chamber, the idiot awoke and viciously headbutted Sandy, then attempted to run. Lying on his left side, on the floor of the cistern, Sandy saw Morandarth lift his visible bulk to lunge after the screaming man. Sandy spied tentacles under the monster that widened dramatically the further they went into the earth, like the roots of a mighty tree. At that moment, Sandy's mind conjured an image of Morandarth's root system traversing hundreds of miles of earthy loam, deep under the water table. The tentacles pushed through rock like a fork through cake. Morandarth likely caused Sandy's mind to descry the enormity of Morandarth's being. There was no other explanation for it beyond simple imagination. Sandy had stopped believing in his imagination long before that terrible day. Morandarth had snagged the fleeing sacrifice with its outstretched tentacles, settled its bulk down with a boom of wet flatulence, and slowly pulled the screaming stalker into its mouth. The eating went on for hours. The shrieks only lasted about 45 minutes. Sandy watched it all. Morandarth continues in a tone a few decibels lower. If Morandarth wills that Sandy Kavanaugh is the final sacrifice that Sandy Kavanaugh is responsible for bringing to Morandarth, then that is what Sandy Kavanaugh's demise shall be. As he speaks, Sandy returns to his kneeling position. Yes, Morandarth's will be done. Morandarth settles into more conversational tone. Of course Morandarth's will be done. What other will could there possibly be? Sandy Kavanaugh came to Morandarth 43 of Sandy Kavanaugh's years ago and begged Morandarth for success as a writer and great wealth. Morandarth knew that Sandy Kavanaugh would not achieve either without the help of Morandarth, and so Morandarth bargained with Sandy Kavanaugh. Morandarth has held up Morandarth's side of this accord. It is now or never to plead his case, Sandy surmises. Mighty Morandarth. He flinches at the inclusion of this adjective, but the demon's tentacles merely twitch rather than strike out at him. Is wise and powerful and eternal. Morandarth's servant is growing older, weaker, possibly infirm. Sandy Kavanaugh's physicians suspect that Sandy Kavanaugh might have a cancerous polyp in Sandy Kavanaugh's colon. Morandarth knows this and all things. Yes, indeed, Morandarth does. Given that Sandy Kavanaugh's health might soon prohibit him, Sandy Kavanaugh, from being able to procure sacrifices and serve Morandarth, Sandy lets the question hang in the fetid air. Morandarth stays silent. In fact, all visible movement ceases. Sandy does not see the monster's idle tentacles as resting so much as poised to strike, like serpents. Mentally wincing, he continues. Would Morandarth be willing to release Sandy Kavanaugh from Morandarth's service? Not for the benefit of Sandy Kavanaugh, he adds quickly, but to ensure the continued edification of Morandarth's grandeur. Sandy Kavanaugh is not using that word, edification, correctly. Sandy Kavanaugh's peers are correct in assuming that Sandy Kavanaugh is nearly illiterate. Morandarth is also given to reminding Sandy of his shortcomings usually once per visit. At least this time, the demon does not wax poetic about the inadequacy of Sandy's penis, as the demon has gleaned from the mind of Sandy's wife and reported to him multiple times over the years. Apologies, Morandarth. Sandy Kavanaugh's question remains before Morandarth's greatness. The demon's tentacle begins swaying randomly. If Sandy Kavanaugh is not in service to Morandarth, then Sandy Kavanaugh is dead. If Sandy Kavanaugh wishes to leave this chamber alive, unconsumed, then Sandy Kavanaugh will continue to serve Morandarth. Yes, Morandarth, Sandy mumbles. He briefly considers snatching up the torch and jamming it into the massive eye of the creature. The eye is always connected to the brain. Is it not so for all earthbound creatures? There has to be a way to kill this thing and find release. Again, Morandarth's tentacles freeze, poised in the thick air, their tips pointing directly at Sandy. Sandy freezes as well. The only movement in the chamber is the sweat dripping from Sandy's sideburns, down his cheeks, and the rising and falling of his chest. Minutes pass. Sandy's peripheral vision is fixed on the hypnotic flickering of the torch. Morandarth will give Sandy Kavanaugh a second gift, the demon voices in a tone the writer has not heard before, an almost caring, soft voice that stuns Sandy. Thank you, mighty Sandy's sniveling is cut short as a group of Morandarth's tentacles shoot out, embedding their tips in the stones behind them. Two of them have drawn blood, one from his right cheek and the other from his left trapezius muscle. Goose down from the ripped collar of his jacket floats in the thick air. Sandy has the good sense to remain still. If this is the end, then it will be over in an hour or two, he thinks. No, Sandy Kavanaugh, this is not the end. Moran'd'arth offers you a new bargain. In exchange for Sandy Kavanaugh's continued service, Moran'd'arth will not cause what Sandy Kavanaugh terms forensic evidence to come into the possession of the police of this region. Sandy Kavanaugh will not be implicated in dozens of murders. Sandy Kavanaugh's family will not be made insolvent and homeless, and Sandy Kavanaugh will not be consumed by Moran'd'arth. Instead, Sandy Kavanaugh will continue to serve Moran'd'arth throughout the course of Sandy Kavanaugh's colon cancer, for cancer is what Sandy Kavanaugh already has. Sandy Kavanaugh will continue to bring sacrifices to Moran'd'arth even after the disease spreads to Sandy Kavanaugh's liver and lymph nodes, eventually metastasizing in Sandy Kavanaugh's brain. Sandy Kavanaugh will die a painful, lingering death in 2 of Sandy Kavanaugh's years' time. Sandy stands unmoving, the cold dread of truth washing down his spine. Or Moran'd'arth will consume Sandy Kavanaugh on this very day, at this very hour, in such a way that will make Sandy Kavanaugh's suffering through cancer seem like the orgasmic culmination of sexual coupling. The tentacles retract, slicing through several other locations on Sandy's body on their way back to the demon. Before Sandy can answer one way or another, as if such a decision is even needed, the beast's entire form shudders. The ground shakes enough for the pig's skeleton to clatter out of shape, reminding Sandy that he has not bagged it up yet. The torch vibrates out of its holder and falls to the floor. Sandy hesitates before finally picking up the torch and placing it back in the depression dug into the wall for it. The last time he saw Moran'd'arth react this way, there had been a particularly horrific school shooting. The one in Florida, Sandy recalls. Certainly, something terrible has happened somewhere, and the demon's limbs have gleaned the fear, resentment, guilt, and suffering from the world like a human takes in air. Moran'd'arth was not this large in the 1980s. The monster has doubled in size in the last decade alone, but Sandy doesn't like to think too much about this. Sandy hopes the cancer will finish him before the monster outgrows this cellar. Sandy begins envisioning the creation of a charity into which he can funnel most of his wealth. Of course, his wife and adult daughters will be taken care of for the rest of their lives. He will stipulate that this property be sold, and that this barn... No, best not to actively think of it. Sandy struggles not to think of trucks and concrete and cleansing fire. Sandy Kavanaugh may leave Moran'd'arth's presence now. A grating sound echoes around the chamber, hurting Sandy's ears. Sandy Kavanaugh's schemes against Moran'd'arth will come to naught. Remember that Moran'd'arth has given Sandy Kavanaugh a great gift today, and Moran'd'arth can revoke this gift. Sandy Kavanaugh can always suffer more greatly. Now, leave Moran'd'arth. Sandy flees the chamber, then the barn, utterly forgetting to collect the porcine bones. He stumbles into the house, breathing heavily. He shucks his coat, gloves, and boots, then drinks himself completely drunk inside of 30 minutes. He does not answer his wife's questions about why he is suddenly day drinking. He has 2 years left to keep this terrible, terrible secret. Only 2 years. Sandy weeps with joy for the first time in his long life, then passes out in his recliner before lunchtime. Thank you everybody for listening in, and of course this video will be available to watch later if you weren't able to catch it live. Stay safe, keep your hands 6 feet apart, and wash your friends daily. Talk to you guys later.